everyone, Alec Elcher the SideQuest Gamer here, and today I'm going to take a look at Super Mario Bros. 2. No, I'm talking about the American version of Super Mario Bros. 2. I think I made that joke before. Anyways, let's start the review. Oh jeez, it's been so long since I last played this game. For those of you who don't know, this was the first game I reviewed on this channel, and it was awful. Bad microphone, clunky editing, atrocious commentary quality, and pretty much how not to do a first video. Worst of all, I vaguely explained why I liked this game as much as I did, and I was way too generous with the rating. Not to mention, I only played through the first world, and despite beating the game before on multiple occasions, I still should have played through at least most of the game in order to have an updated opinion. Everyone hates their first video, but not as much as I hate mine. Okay, I don't hate it, but it is some of the most cringeworthy content I put on this channel. Although this isn't even my first channel, as I used to do really bad cringeworthy content, which my friends on Skype seem to enjoy ironically. So while I never grew up with this game and played this in my mid-teens, this game does have some sentimental value to me as a Z-list YouTube reviewer. But enough about that. I want to evaluate this game further, and also to dispel the biggest misconception with this game being a rip-off of the Japanese game Yu Kojo Doki Doki Panic. Prototype that later developed into Yu Kojo Doki Doki Panic was originally going to be a planned Mario game that had vertical scrolling levels, 2-player co-op, and the ability to throw and even stack blocks. However, a lot of these ideas were scrapped because it was too much for the NES and Famicom consoles to handle, so director and developer of the prototype, Kensuke Tanabe, decided to work with Shigeru Miyamoto's team to create something that worked with some of the ideas. Why did Doki Doki Panic happen in the first place? Well, Nintendo had a licensing agreement with networked Fuji Television as a promotion for the Yu Kojo event of 1987. The game that would be developed starred the mother, father, and 2 sibling mascots of the festival itself. We never got Doki Doki Panic in its old form. It wouldn't make much sense to do so, as Doki Doki Panic was released to promote a Japanese TV festival advertising Japanese TV shows that no one in America would even know exists. So of course they would have to rebrand it with a familiar Nintendo mascot and 3 other notable characters from the previous game. So in 1988, America finally saw the release of the long-awaited sequel to Super Mario Bros. It's not a ripoff because not only was it from the same publisher who released Doki Doki Panic, Super Mario Bros. 2 was also rebranded by the same development team, being Nintendo R&D 4, who also worked on the first game. I mean, can someone honestly tell me how it's even possible for Nintendo to rip off Nintendo? Anyone? Come on, I could be here all day. Someone please argue that point. No one? Of course, that's what I thought. Provided the Super Mario Bros. 2 is a rip-off of Doki Doki Panic crowd, as a minority of Mario fans, surprisingly, most Mario fans think this game is good on its own merits. I haven't heard anyone say they dislike the game. I mostly hear they think that it's the weakest in the NES trilogy, although there are a few who consider this game to be the best in the NES trilogy. Changes from Doki Doki Panic include mostly items redesigned to resemble familiar Mario Universe items, sprite changes, and other aesthetic changes like the waterfall speed. The original waterfall speed was nauseating to look at, while the update makes it a lot better on the eyes. There's also the addition of the boss claw grip and the removal of the 3rd Mauser. Unfortunately, Doki Doki Panic's save system was removed for the American version, which had a limited continue system instead. When you begin the game and wait a few seconds, text shows up explaining the story of how an evil frog king named Wart has locked up all the inhabitants of Subcon, so Mario and company go to Subcon to face the evil Wart once and for all to free the people of Subcon. Think of it, this is like the only console entry in the Super Mario platformer series where Bowser's not in the game at all. Instead we have this villain Wart, who's kind of cool, and I wish he would appear in future Mario installments and not just a cameo in The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening for the Game Boy. At the beginning of each level, you get to choose from 4 characters, each with their own unique abilities. Mario is the most balanced of the 4, Toad has the worst jump height but can pick up things the fastest, Princess Peach, Toadstool, picks up things the slowest, making Birdo encounters rather difficult, but she can hover temporarily, and Luigi can jump the highest, but his jumps are really floaty and a little hard to control. I personally use Toad and Mario the most, while I use Luigi the least. I like having some control over my characters, and Luigi is fine for falling down an area and avoiding spikes, but I really couldn't think of any other use for him other than to break a level's progression. Speaking of controls, they are a major improvement over the first game, which kind of had awkward feeling controls, like I don't have a lot of control with Mario, especially when jumping. His jumps are like really heavy. But here, the jumps and movement are not as stiff and very comfortable for the most part. Picking up vegetables and throwing them at enemies is also immensely satisfying, just seeing them fly off screen. And I like how each character can do a high jump by holding down for a few seconds and then executing a high jump. This can break the levels sometimes, but it's a nice feature to make this game stand out from the predecessor. As for the levels themselves, it's a nice addition being able to backtrack the screen as well as have some vertical scrolling level design connected to the horizontal. It makes these levels feel massive and less artificial than the ones in the original game. The first world is your typical grass level, teaching you with basic obstacles on how to play the game in the first 2 levels. Then level 3 of this world throws in more complex versions of the puzzles, like the door and key, as well as a harder boss than the mini-boss Birdos. The second world is a set of desert levels, and I always use Toad for these levels because in certain areas are ground that you have to constantly dig at, and because Toad can pick up things the fastest, I always use him. The third world is mainly filled with waterfalls and caves, and they're not too bad, but the caves have a lot of bomb puzzles that can slow down the pace a bit. Other than that, it's fine. The fourth world, being the obligatory ice world, is where the game picks up the challenge. It introduces a lot of platforming with ice physics, and it's really refreshing to do this kind of platforming. I usually take the princess with me because it makes the platforming much easier, and an accidental fall potentially non-fatal thanks to the hover ability. The fifth world really amps up the difficulty. Sure, it takes place at night, which is arguably the most dangerous time of day, but with bob-ombs, they cost me quite a bit of lives, and got me a few game overs in previous playthroughs. And the sixth world is another set of desert levels, and it's not too bad, although that part where you have to ride one of those birds can be challenging thanks to the incoming birds and flying enemies. The seventh and final world, unlike the other worlds that have 3 levels, this one just has 2 levels, although they're really long levels, and it takes place in the sky. Basically every enemy is out to get you, and each level is filled with Birdo enemies. Things can get pretty hectic, so be careful. There's plenty of enemies, and the introduction of puzzles is a nice touch as well, like finding a key and taking it to its designated door while avoiding the likes of the Phantos, who are the guardians of the key, mind you. They're quite deadly, but they can go away if you drop the key temporarily and wait a few seconds. And that's just for a few levels, but it does make the game much more interesting. I also like the addition of mini-bosses where you fight variations of the gender-ambiguous Birdo throughout the game, and it gets harder and harder as the game progresses. But throwing their pellets back at them and getting their crystal ball to exit a level is just so much fun. And at the end of each world, you fight an actual boss, and let me tell you, these are the best boss battles in the NES trilogy. For one thing, they're not stupidly easy. They can actually provide a nice challenge, and there's enough variety to make each boss stand out from the other. Sure, you have to fight Mouser and Triclide twice, but there are different environmental circumstances to make them feel somewhat different. Frag Eye, Claw Grip, and the final boss being Wart were pretty challenging as well, with Claw Grip being my favorite in the game and Frag Eye being the most unique in terms of attack strategy. Wart may be challenging, but he's arguably one of the best final bosses in 8-bit gaming, if you ignore the logic behind the way to defeat him. Really, a vegetable machine in the same room you fight him? The game also has a great assortment of items. The Power Blocks, it's a neat callback to the Mario Bros. Arcade game, and it takes out almost every enemy on screen, although they're pretty uncommon. But the best power-up is the Health Mushroom you can collect in the Dark Dimension of Subcon, which you can access by uprooting a potion, but you can only go in a limited given space, so place the potion wisely in order to get the opportunity to get the mushroom that increases your maximum hit points for the rest of the levels. And the 2 mushrooms are in the same exact places every time. It's not like they're randomized. You can also collect coins for the end level slot machine where you have the opportunity to get extra lives, but I'd be lucky to leave that post level minigame with 1 extra life. It's also worth noting that this game isn't really hard, but there are 2 limited continues you can use after a game over, which is an improvement from the first game. But I would definitely say, because of the enemies and puzzles, this game is the most challenging of the NES trilogy. However, there was never really a moment I was frustrated, and usually when I died, it was my own fault. But it is worth noting that if you use a continue, you start back at the beginning of the world and not the level you left off in. Take that as you will. The graphics and music have seen a significant improvement. The sprites are much more detailed than its predecessor, of course in 1988, that's a definite given, and the foreground and backgrounds are colorful and nice to look at. The visuals haven't held up the best on the NES, but they do a fine job and hold up for the most part. And as for the music, it's great. I love the main theme that plays in every level, and the boss theme is pretty intense and memorable. The indoor theme is alright, but kind of forgettable, and does have a short loop period, making it kind of repetitive, especially since you spend a lot of time indoors. And the Dark Dimension theme is pretty much the Super Mario Bros. 1 theme, and because you're only in this dimension for a few seconds, I'm not given enough time to absorb the theme as I would the others. I also really like War's theme, as it gives a sense of finality with one last challenge being present before you beat the game. It's kind of eerie and sinister, which is very appropriate for a battle against the final boss. And overall, Super Mario Bros. 2 USA is not only a good game, but I argue a good sequel as well. Sure, it's much different than its predecessor, but I consider this game to be one of the most important entries for developing the Super Mario platformer series as it is today. Traits from this game, like the ability to pick things up, are recycled in Super Mario Bros. 3, World, 64, etc. Enemies like Birdo, Bob-ombs, and especially Shy Guys make appearances all over the Mario franchise. While they're not as iconic as Goombas and Koopas, they're iconic enough for fans of the franchise, and differentiating Luigi's abilities by making him taller and can do a floaty higher jump would become a series staple. Sure, he could jump higher in the Japanese sequel, which I'll get to next, but not to the degree of this game. Not to mention the different level themes change up the gameplay immensely. Like in the snow levels of Super Mario Bros., all it was a cosmetic difference, but in Super Mario Bros. 2, they actually put in ice physics. This game also introduces the desert theme to the series, and even has things like quicksand, which would return in later entries. I understand that this game isn't going to click with all Mario fans, but I personally think this is the progressive sequel Super Mario Bros. 1 deserved. I'd give it an 83 out of 100. This game is so much fun, Nintendo even re-released this version in Japan as Super Mario Bros. USA. I'm not sure if it's because of the expired license to distribute the Yum Kojo version and they just want to reuse the assets for a cheap sale, but they did it anyways, and I guess if anyone has the right to complain that it's a ripoff of Doki Doki Panic, it's the Japanese gamers, not the American audience. But what about the Game Boy Advance remake that came out in 2001? Well, lucky for you, I'm going to take a look at that right now, just to extend this video's length so I get more ad revenue. Now before you ask, I'll talk about the Super Mario All-Stars remakes of the 8-bit quadrilogy in their own video. In the series I'll begin called All the Other Versions, but as for this version, Super Mario Advance improves so much. For one thing, the graphics have been heavily updated for the 32-bit handheld, and they look a lot better than the NES's graphics. Of course, with this being released about 13 years after the NES version, that's pretty much a given. But as always, it is much appreciated. There are also the addition of voice clips from Mario, Peach, Toad, and Luigi, as well as Birdo and the rest of the bosses. They are a nice way to show off the sound capabilities of the new handheld, as this game was released as a launch title.
Yeah, come on! Who's a player? Here we go! Yeah! This is as far as you go!
This version is much more forgiving with health pickups being spread everywhere, and there's also giant vegetables and giant enemies to accompany it. The third boss, being the second Mauser in the NES version, was replaced with an exclusive boss in this version called Birdo, and it's actually a really fun boss fight. The best update I can think of is the ability to save at any level, and if you die, you get to start at the level you left off in. While I got used to the less forgiving gameplay style from the NES version, I pretty much prefer the save system as I play games for the adventure. I don't want to be spoon-fed my victories, but I do think you can present a challenge without making the player go all the way back to the start. Others may disagree, but other people are not me, and I know what I like and why I like one design choice more than another. A good example would be Sonic 3 and Knuckles and how it included a save system, but still had enough challenges to make the players think outside the box and want to get better at the game, compared to Sonic the Hedgehog 1 and 2, and how they made the player go all the way back to the beginning of the game, making them face obstacles they already mastered. The music has also seen an update, and I don't know if I like it more or less than the NES versions. I do prefer this version's Wart theme. The indoor theme is just as forgettable. I prefer the NES version of the main theme, and I like both versions of the boss themes equally. I don't know. All I know is that both soundtracks really complement the platforms they are on, and they're both really good. The Game Boy Advance version also includes things like mini games where you can hunt for Yoshi eggs within the levels, but that side quest video will happen in the distant future when the time comes. And overall, I think this version is much better and more accessible than the NES version. Sure, the NES version was good, but this remake is just great. It's just everything I wanted out of the original version. I'd give this version of Super Mario Bros. 2 a 92 out of 100. It's by far the definitive version to play, and this version itself is easily in my top 10 favorite Super Mario games. I still, however, think the NES version is good in its own right, and worth playing for the $5 asking price on the eShop. But if you haven't played either version, give them both a shot. Heck, even the Super Mario Advance remake is available on the Wii U eShop. Thank goodness for options. So that's all I have to say about Super Mario Bros. 2. I like it both as its own game and as a sequel to Super Mario Bros. It just did so much for the franchise. But as for my thoughts on the actual Super Mario Bros. 2 Japan got that we didn't, well, you'll see in my 99th review, and I have quite a bit to say about it. But until then, thank you all so much for watching, and remember to stay awesome.